The Bridgewater Triangle is not a place most people think about on a regular basis, but if you live close enough to it, you never really stop thinking about it either. It sits in southeastern Massachusetts, covering roughly 200 square miles between the towns of Abington, Rehoboth, and Freetown. Researchers have been documenting strange activity inside that region since the 1970s, when a cryptozoologist named Loren Coleman first put a name to it in his book, Mysterious America. The list of documented phenomena is long. UFO sightings going back generations. Bigfoot reports near the Hockomock Swamp. Giant birds with wingspans that had no business existing in New England. Cult activity and ritualistic animal sacrifice inside the Freetown State Forest. Poltergeist activity in homes along the southern edge. Unsolved disappearances that the local departments never quite managed to close. The story you are about to hear is fiction. It was built from the kinds of things that had come out of that region for decades, but the events and the people in it are not real. I want to be upfront about that before we go any further. My name is Caden Merrill, and I worked as a game warden on the eastern edge of the Bridgewater Triangle for 11 years. I took the post when I was 26 years old because I wanted land and quiet and a job that kept me outside. I got all three of those things. The region I covered ran from the lower edge of Hockomock Swamp down through a stretch of state forest that bumped up against the Freetown line. It was not a dramatic landscape. It was dense and flat, and in the low areas with stretches of old oak and pine that blocked the light even on clear days. I learned it the way you learn anything you spend enough time with. I knew which trails flooded in early spring. I knew where the deer bedded down in November and where they avoided without reason. I knew the sounds the swamp made at different times of year, and I knew when those sounds were wrong. I was not a superstitious man. I had no patience for the triangle mythology that drew tourists and ghost hunters to the region every fall. I had walked most of that land on foot, and I had never seen anything I could not explain with time and a clear head. That changed in the third week of October, during my 9th year on the post. It started small the way most things that matter tend to start. I was running a routine patrol along the Southern Fire Road when I came across 3 whitetail deer dead in a depression off the east side of the trail. They were not scattered the way predator kills scatter. They were laid out in a loose line with no visible wounds and no signs of struggle in the ground around them. No tracks coming in or going out. No blood. No smell beyond what fresh death always carries. I photographed them and filed a report and told myself it was probably a disease vector moving through the herd. 2 weeks later, I found a trail I had never seen before cutting northwest off the main access road. That trail should not have been there. I had walked that access road more times than I could count, and there was nothing cutting northwest off it. The trail looked used. The ground was pressed down the way ground gets when feet move over it regularly. It ran about 60 yards in the tree line before the brush closed around it and it disappeared. I marked it on my map and kept moving. I told myself I had simply missed it before. The cases started the following Monday. I was catching up on paperwork when I pulled a missing persons file that had been sitting in the pending stack for longer than it should have. The file was thin. A name, a physical description, a date the person was last seen near the Freetown Forest boundary. I wanted to pull the reporting party information to follow up, and the field was empty. Not incomplete, not illegible, empty. I assumed it was a data entry error and pulled the next file in the stack. The reporting party field was empty on that one too. I pulled every file in the pending stack and laid them out across my desk. 11 files. Every single one had the same problem. No reporting party. No next of kin listed. No contact number. No one on record had ever called any of these people in. I sat there for a long time looking at those files spread across my desk. I stacked them back up and checked the database to see if the reporting party information had been entered elsewhere in the system. It had not. I ran the names through the state missing persons registry to see if duplicate reports existed under a different case number. 2 of the 11 names did not appear in the registry at all. I checked my own entry logs to see if I had somehow pulled files from the wrong stack. The files had come from the active pending bin, which meant someone in the department had flagged them as open and current. I pulled the case dates. The oldest file in the stack was dated 19 years back. I sat with that for a minute. A missing persons case 19 years old with no reporting party had been sitting in an active pending bin long enough to outlast 2 wardens before me. I started going further back. I pulled the archive files from the storage cabinet along the back wall and started working through them. The pattern held. Cases going back 30 years with no reporting party. No one who ever called. No family member who filed a report. No employer who noticed an absence. These people had simply stopped existing in the record, with no one on the outside of the record noticing they were gone. I was still at my desk when the sun went down. I had a stack of 43 files with no reporting parties spread across every flat surface in the office. I had a map with the case locations plotted in red marker. The clusters were not random. They were specific. 3 locations repeated across nearly every file regardless of the decade. The dates repeated too. Late October into the first week of November showed up more than any other window across 40 years of cases. Something had been operating inside that triangle on a schedule that predated my career by decades. I locked the office and drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for a while before going inside. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation, a filing error that compounded over years, a systemic gap in the department's intake process, something administrative and boring that I would find once I dug deeper. I almost believed it. Almost. When I pulled into the station, the next morning there were 2 new files on my desk. No reporting party on either one. I set my coffee down and picked up the first one. The missing person was a male in his mid-40s, last seen near the Hockomock Swamp access road. The second was a female in her late 20s, last seen near the Freetown Forest boundary. Both files were dated the current week. Both had come through the standard intake system. Both had no reporting party. I checked the intake log to see who had entered them. The log showed the files had been entered by the system automatically through an inter-department data transfer. I called the data transfer office and asked them to trace the origin. The woman on the phone put me on hold for 4 minutes and came back sounding confused. She told me the transfer had no origin point on record. The files had appeared in the system with no source department attached. I thanked her and hung up and looked at the 2 new files sitting on my desk next to the stack of 43. I picked up the red marker and added the 2 new locations to my map. They fell inside the same clusters as every other case. I stood at that map for a long time. The pattern was too clean to be administrative error. The locations were too specific. The dates were too consistent. Something was generating these files and sending them to my desk. I did not know what that meant yet. I was not ready to think about what it meant. I drove out to the first cluster location that afternoon. It was a low area off a fire road about 2 miles inside the forest boundary. I had been to that spot before on routine patrol and never thought much of it. I parked the truck and walked in. The trees were thicker than I remembered. The light was wrong for the time of day. The ground was soft underfoot in a way that had nothing to do with recent rain. I stood in the middle of that low area and listened. The forest was completely silent. Not quiet, silent. No birds. No wind movement in the branches. No insects. Just a flat, dead stillness that pressed against my ears away silence only does when something has made everything else stop. I walked back to the truck faster than I meant to. I sat behind the wheel and wrote my notes and told myself the silence was seasonal. I pulled out of the lot and started back up the fire road, Halfway to the main road, I looked in my rearview mirror. Something was standing at the edge of the tree line where the fire road met the forest. It was tall. It was still. By the time I got the truck stopped and looked back, it was gone. I drove back to the station and sat at my desk and opened the archive files again. I started pulling everything I could find on the 3 cluster locations. The files went back further than the cabinet went. I submitted a records request to the state archive for anything older. While I waited, I kept working through what I had. One name kept appearing in the margin notes of the older files, not as a missing person. As a reference, Arthur Voss. The name appeared in 4 separate files across 3 different decades. Always in the margin. Always in the same tight handwriting that was not mine and not any warden I had worked with. I ran the name through the department database. Nothing. I ran it through the state employee registry. Nothing. I searched it through the public records system and got one result. A brief mention in a regional newspaper archive from 22 years back. The article was about unusual animal deaths near the Hockomock Swamp. Arthur Voss was quoted as a researcher studying unexplained phenomena in the southeastern Massachusetts region. The article was 4 paragraphs long and ended without resolution. I printed it and clipped it to the inside of the oldest file in my stack. I went home that night and could not sleep. I lay in the dark and thought about 43 files with no reporting party and a name written in margins across 3 decades and a thing standing at the edge of a tree line that was gone before I could look at it straight. I got up before dawn and drove back to the station. There were 3 new files on my desk. No reporting party on any of them. I stacked it with the others and stood at my map and added 3 more red marks. They landed in the same clusters. They always landed in the same clusters. I pulled a second case, then a third, all with the same problem. No one had ever reported these people missing. I spent the next 2 days building the map into something I could actually work from. I transferred everything onto a larger sheet of paper and color-coded the clusters by decade so I could see how the pattern had moved or held over time. It had held. The 3 primary locations had not shifted by more than a quarter mile across 40 years of cases. Whatever was responsible for those files was not wandering. It was settled. I ran the coordinates through the department's land survey database to get a clearer picture of what those locations actually were. The first cluster sat in a low marshy area about a mile inside the forest boundary, where the ground stayed wet most of the year. The second was near a granite outcropping on the northeast edge of the Freetown State Forest that the survey maps labeled as profile rock adjacent terrain. The third was deeper in than I had ever patrolled on foot. It sat in an area the older maps marked as restricted access due to unstable ground. I had never had a reason to go there. I had a reason now. I started with the first cluster location because I had already been there once and I knew the access road held. I drove out on a Wednesday morning when the sky was flat gray and the temperature had dropped overnight. I parked at the lot and pulled on my pack and walked in. The trail to the low area was familiar for the first half mile. After that, it felt different. Not physically different. The trail was exactly where it had always been. The trees were the same trees. But there was a quality to the air that I could not name. It was not smell. It was not temperature. It was something closer to pressure. A low, constant weight that sat behind my eyes and did not let up. I reached the low area and stopped at the edge of it. The ground in the depression was disturbed. Not the way animal traffic disturbs ground. The soil had been turned in a deliberate pattern. Long, shallow furrows running parallel to each other, about 2 feet apart, covering most of the depression floor. Each furrow was clean-edged. Whatever made them had not dragged through the soil. It had pressed into it with intention. I photographed everything and crouched at the nearest furrow and looked at it closely. The depth was consistent all the way along. The edges had not crumbled or softened, which meant the furrows were recent, made within the last day or two at most. I stood and looked at the tree line around the depression. On the far side, 3 oaks had markings cut into the bark at chest height. Not random, not animal scratching. They were deliberate cuts arranged in a pattern I did not recognize. Vertical lines crossed by a single diagonal, repeated on all 3 trees in the same position. I photographed them and pulled out my notebook and sketched the pattern by hand. I hiked back to the truck and drove directly to the second cluster location. The granite outcropping area was a 20-minute drive and a half-mile walk from the nearest access point. I had been to that area twice before on routine checks and remembered it as unremarkable. When I got there, the same markings were on the trees. Fresh cuts, same pattern, same chest height position, same diagonal cross. I stood in that spot for a long time. The silence was the same as the first location, complete and deliberate. I took my photographs and hiked out. That night, I uploaded everything to my laptop and sat at the kitchen table going through the images. The photographs from the first location were fine, clear and detailed. The photographs from the second location were black, every single one. The camera showed no error. The memory card showed the files existed. The files opened to pure black. I checked the camera settings and found nothing wrong. I went back the next morning with a different camera. I photographed the markings at the second location from 6 different angles. That night, those images came back black as well. The images from the surrounding trees and ground came out fine. Only the markings photographed black. I printed the sketches I had made by hand and pinned them to the wall above my desk next to the map. I stared at them for a long time, trying to place the pattern. I could not place it. I drove out to the second location, a third time 2 days later, intending to sketch the markings again in more detail. When I reached the trees, the markings were gone. The bark was smooth. There was no scar where the cuts had been. I put my hand flat against the bark of the first tree and held it there. The bark was warm, not ambient temperature warm. Warm the way skin is warm. I pulled my hand back and stepped away from the tree. I walked a slow circle around the depression area, looking at the ground. The furrows from my first visit were gone too. The ground was flat and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been pressed into it. I was still standing in that circle when I became aware that something was at the tree line behind me. I did not hear it arrive. I did not hear any movement at all. I simply became aware of a presence the way you become aware of someone standing too close behind you in a quiet room. I turned around slowly. It was standing at the edge of the trees, about 40 feet away. Tall, still, the light came through it in a way that light should not come through a solid object. It had a shape that suggested a person, but the proportions were not right. The arms were too long. The head was too large. It did not move. It did not make a sound. It looked at me the way something looks at you when it has been watching you for a long time and has finally decided to let you know. I held its gaze for what felt like a full minute. Then I walked backward to the trail and kept my eyes on it until the trees blocked my view. I made it back to the truck. I sat behind the wheel, and my hands were steady, which surprised me. I drove back to the station and sat at my desk. There was a new file waiting. The location marked inside was the exact coordinates of the second cluster site, the one I had just left. No reporting party. I picked up the file and read through it twice. The missing person was a male in his early 50s. Last seen near the granite outcropping area 3 days ago. No next of kin listed. No employer contact. No one who had filed a report. I set the file down and pulled my map toward me and looked at the second cluster location marked in red. 3 days ago, I had not yet visited that site. The file had been generated before I went there. Whatever was sending me these cases knew where I was going before I got there. I locked up the station and drove home and sat on the back porch until it got dark. I thought about the warm bark and the photographs that came back black, and the thing at the tree line that let me see it on purpose. I thought about Arthur Voss and the margin notes across 3 decades of files. I ran Voss through every search I had access to the following morning and came up empty across all of them. No address, no professional record, no death certificate, no forwarding information of any kind. He had simply stopped appearing in any record after that newspaper article from 22 years back. I submitted a broader records request to the state archive and flagged it as urgent. 2 days later, the archive called back. They had one record matching Arthur Voss, a residential address in a town on the western edge of the triangle. The address was 20 years old. I wrote it down anyway and drove out there that afternoon. The house was a single-story wood frame set back from the road on a dirt lot. The grass had grown up through the gravel of the driveway. The windows were dark. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. The air inside was stale, but not the stale of abandonment. It was the stale of a place that had been closed up deliberately, like someone had shut it down and left with the intention of not coming back. The furniture was still there. A table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf along the back wall still holding books, a coat still hanging by the door. I moved through the house slowly. The kitchen had dishes in the drying rack. The bedroom had a made bed. Nothing had been packed. Nothing had been taken. Whoever left this house had walked out and not returned and had not planned for returning. On the kitchen table, there was a cardboard box. It was the only thing in the house that looked deliberately placed. It sat in the center of the table with no lid. Inside were papers, notebooks, loose sheets covered in handwriting, newspaper clippings held together with a rusted binder clip. I picked up the top notebook and opened it. The handwriting inside was the same tight script I had seen in the margins of my case files. Arthur Voss had been here. These were his notes. I carried the box to my truck and drove back to the station and spent the rest of the day reading. Voss had documented everything: the cluster locations, the date patterns, the markings on the trees. He had found the same furrows in the same depression and photographed them with the same result: black images. He had sketched the markings by hand the same way I had. His sketches matched mine exactly. He had mapped the cases going back further than my archive went. His map showed the same 3 clusters. He had noted the silence at each location and described it the same way I had described it in my own notes: the pressure behind the eyes, the flat, dead stillness. His notes filled 4 notebooks and covered what looked like 3 years of investigation. The last notebook ended mid-sentence, not at the bottom of a page. Mid-sentence in the middle of a page with the pen line trailing off to the right, as if his hand had simply stopped moving. Tucked inside the back cover of the last notebook was a newspaper clipping held with a paper clip. The clipping was a brief item from a regional paper dated 22 years back. It reported that a researcher named Arthur Voss had entered the Freetown State Forest to investigate reported phenomena and had not returned. A search had been conducted. No trace was found. The search had been called off after 4 days. There was no follow-up article. I set the clipping down and sat back in my chair. Voss had walked into that forest and not come out. He had left his notes behind deliberately. The box had been sitting centered on that table, waiting for someone to find it. He had known someone would follow the same trail he followed. He had left the notes as a warning. The last page of the last notebook had 4 words written at the top before the sentence that trailed off. The 4 words were underlined twice. Do not go in. I read those 4 words 3 times. I looked at my map with its red clusters. I looked at the stack of files with no reporting party. I looked at Voss's sketches of the markings that matched my own. Then I drove home and could not sleep again. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about a man who had spent 3 years building the same picture I was building and had ended up in that forest. Something at the tree line on my drive home made me check my mirror twice. Both times the road behind me was empty. I read through Voss's notebooks 3 more times over the next 2 days. I was looking for anything I had missed on the first pass. Names, dates, specific coordinates. Anything that pointed to what he had found before his notes ended. The notebooks were thorough up until the last few pages where the entries got shorter and the handwriting got tighter, as if he was writing faster or with less patience for detail. The last dozen entries were stripped down to single observations. Markings moved overnight. 3 new files on the desk this morning. It is watching the station, now not just the forest edge. The pressure is constant. I can hear it thinking. That last line stopped me. I read it 4 times. I can hear it thinking. I did not know what that meant, and I was not sure I wanted to find out. I went back to the earlier notebooks looking for the point where his tone shifted. It shifted in the second notebook about halfway through. Before that point, his writing was clinical and measured. After that point, it was still precise, but there was an urgency underneath it that had not been there before. The shift happened the day after he described going further into the forest than he had gone before. He had not written about what he found that day. The entry for that day was a single line. I found the 3rd location. Below that line, the page was blank, and the next entry started 2 days later with a different quality to the handwriting entirely. I marked that page and set the notebook down. Whatever Voss had found at the 3rd cluster location had changed something in him. I had not yet gone to the 3rd location. It was the deepest one, the one the survey maps marked as restricted access. I had been telling myself I was saving it for last because it was the hardest to reach. That was not the whole truth. I pulled my map and looked at the 3rd cluster coordinates. The location sat about 3 miles into the Freetown State Forest past the last maintained trail. The ground in that area was marked as unstable on every map I had. Peat bog underlayer with surface soil that could hold weight in dry conditions but became unreliable after rain. We had not had significant rain in 2 weeks. I told myself the ground would hold. I packed my gear the following morning and drove to the nearest access point and went on foot. The first 2 miles were familiar territory. I had patrolled this stretch of forest dozens of times and knew it well enough to move through it quickly. At the 2-mile mark, the maintained trail ended and the forest floor took over. The undergrowth was dense but passable. I used my compass and moved northwest toward the 3rd cluster coordinates. At about 2.5 miles, and the forest changed. It was the same change I felt at the other locations, but stronger here. The pressure behind my eyes came on fast, instead of building gradually. The silence dropped like a door closing. One step I could hear my own footfalls and the sound of brush against my jacket. The next step I could hear nothing at all, not even myself. I stopped walking and stood still and watched the tree line around me. Nothing moved. The light had a flat quality that made it hard to judge the time of day. I checked my watch. It read the same time it had read 10 minutes ago. I shook it, and the second hand was moving. The watch was running. The time was simply wrong. I kept moving. The ground stayed firm underfoot, which was the one thing going in my favor. I reached the coordinates for the 3rd cluster location 20 minutes later and stopped at the edge of a clearing I had not known existed. The clearing was roughly circular, about 60 feet across. The trees around its edge were old growth, much older than anything else I had seen in this part of the forest. Their trunks were wide enough that 2 people could not link hands around them. The bark on every tree facing the clearing had the same markings. Not fresh cuts like the ones at the other locations. These were deep and old. The wood around them had grown over the edges of the cuts over what must have been decades. These markings had been here a very long time. In the center of the clearing, the ground was different. The soil was dark and compressed the way soil gets when it has been used regularly over a long period of time. At the base of one of the old growth trees on the north edge of the clearing, there was a campsite. Not a recent campsite, a permanent one. A flat area of ground with a worn depression where someone had slept, a ring of stones with old ash in the center, a length of cord strung between two branches, holding what remained of a canvas tarp rotted to threads. Beside the stone ring there was a metal tin with a tight-fitting lid. I crouched and opened it. Inside were 3 items: a folded piece of paper, a compass, a hand-drawn map on yellow paper. The compass needle spun freely and would not settle. The map showed the clearing I was standing in with the 3 cluster locations marked and lines connecting them. In the margin, Voss had written a date from 14 years ago and 4 words. It was here then. I unfolded the paper. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to the regional warden's office. The letter was from Voss. It was dated 3 years before I had taken the post, which meant someone had held this job before me, and Voss had written to that person. The letter said he had been coming to this clearing for years, that the thing he had found here was not dangerous in the way dangerous things usually are, that it did not attack. It observed. It collected. It had been here longer than any record he could find. The letter said the cases would keep coming, and that whoever held the warden post would keep getting pulled toward this location. He said stopping was not possible once the files started arriving. He said the only choice was how far and you were willing to go. The letter ended with the same instruction as the last notebook. Do not go in. He had written that, and then clearly gone back in himself. I folded the letter and put it in my pack. I stood up and turned to face the clearing. The figure was standing on the south edge between 2 of the old growth trees. It had not been there when I arrived. It was closer than it had ever been, close enough that I could see it had no face. Not that its face was hidden or obscured. It simply had no face. A smooth surface where a face should have been. It stood with its arms at its sides, and its head tilted slightly as if listening to something I could not hear. It did not move toward me. I took 3 slow steps backward toward the north edge of the clearing. It matched my movement, not by stepping, by being closer. The distance between us did not change regardless of how I moved. I stopped moving. It stopped moving. I stood there for a long moment, and then turned and walked north out clearing at a steady pace, and did not look back. I made it back to the 2-mile mark before my radio came back on. I made it back to the truck before my hands started shaking. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before I drove. On the passenger seat, my pack sat with Voss's letter inside it. I drove back to the station in the dark. There were no new files on my desk that night. There was one waiting when I came in the next morning. The location inside was a clearing. My name was written in the reporting party field. I had not filed that report. I picked up that file and read it twice. My name was in the reporting party field in the same font as every other entry in the system. Not handwritten, not added after the fact. Typed into the system the way every other report was typed. I had not filed this report. I had not been near a department terminal since the previous afternoon. I checked the intake log. The file had been entered at 2:14 in the morning. The station had been locked. I was the only one with a key. I set the file down and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. The thing in the forest had filed a missing persons report and put my name on it as a reporting party. I did not know what to do with that. I thought about calling my supervisor and describing what I had found. I thought about how that conversation would go. I thought about the transfer request I had been considering for the past week and whether putting it in would change anything. I drove out to the second cluster location that evening at dusk. I had no clear reason for going. I told myself I wanted to check the tree line before dark. The real reason was that I needed to see whether it was there. It was there, standing at the tree line in the same position as before, still watching. I sat in the truck with the engine running and looked at it through the windshield. It looked back. We stayed like that for about 10 minutes. Then it stepped back into the trees and was gone. I drove home. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the dark for a while before going inside. I thought about Voss writing "do not go in" and then going back in. I thought about the letter addressed to the warden before me and whether that warden had gone in too. I thought about the clearing and the campsite and the worn depression in the ground where someone had slept for what looked like years. I went inside and made something to eat and went to bed and actually slept for the first time in a week. In the morning, I put in a transfer request. By noon, it had been denied. No reason given. I stared at the denial notice for a long time. Then I looked at my map. Then I looked at the stack of files. 3 new ones had arrived while I was reading the denial. No reporting party on any of them. The locations fell inside the same clusters. I pinned the denial notice to the wall next to the map and the sketches and went back to work. The cases kept coming. 2 or 3 a week landing on my desk with no reporting party and locations inside the triangle. I worked through them the way I worked through everything. Methodically, I cross-referenced each new case against the existing clusters and noted any variation. There was no variation. The pattern held without exception. On the 8th day after my visit to the clearing, I drove out to the 3rd cluster location again, not to go in. I told myself I was just checking the access road. I parked at the lot and sat with the engine off and looked at the tree line. The forest was still in the way it always was at that edge. Then the figure stepped out of the tree line and stood in the open, not at the edge. In the open, 30 feet from my truck, in full view with nothing between us. I sat very still. It stood very still. Then it turned and walked back into the forest. Not quickly, not urgently. The way you walk when you want someone to follow you. I sat in the truck for a long time after it disappeared into the trees. Then I drove back to the station. A new case file was on my desk. The location was a clearing. My name was in the reporting party field again. I did not go back in for 11 days. I worked my regular patrol routes and processed the files that kept arriving and told myself I was thinking it through. The truth was simpler than that. I was not ready. The figure had walked back into that forest like it expected me to follow, and I had sat in my truck and driven away, and that decision sat with me every day after. I knew I was going back. I had known it since the day I found Voss's notes. The only question was when I would stop pretending otherwise. On the 11th day, I packed my gear before dawn and drove to the 3rd cluster access point, and went in before the sun was fully up. I moved fast through the first 2 miles. I knew the route now and did not need to think about it. At the 2-mile mark where the maintained trail ended, I picked up the compass bearing for the clearing and pushed into the undergrowth. The forest was different on this visit. The pressure behind my eyes came on within the first 100 yards past the trail end. Not gradually, immediately, like stepping into a room where the air pressure has been changed. I kept moving. My radio cut out at the same point it had cut out before. My watch stopped at the same point it had stopped before. I noted both in my log and kept walking. The ground held firm. The light was wrong again. Flat and directionless the way light gets when the sky is completely overcast, but there were no clouds visible through the canopy. I reached the clearing in less time than the previous visit. 20 minutes less by my dead watch, which was not reliable but felt accurate. The clearing was empty when I stepped into it. The old growth trees stood at the edges with their deep carved markings. The campsite was undisturbed from my last visit. The stone ring, the rotted tarp, the worn depression in the ground. I walked to the center of the clearing and stopped. I turned a slow circle looking at the tree line. Nothing at the edges. Nothing in the spaces between the old-growth trunks. I was alone in the clearing for the first time. I crossed the campsite and crouched at the stone ring and looked into the ash. The ash was disturbed. Something had moved through it recently. Not wind. The pattern of disturbance was too specific. I stood and looked at the worn depression where someone had slept. There was an impression in it that had not been there on my last visit. Fresh. The kind of impression a body leaves when it's been lying in the same spot for a long time. I stepped back from the campsite and turned to face the south edge of clearing. The figure was there, closer than it had ever been. 15 feet, close enough that I could see the texture of it, or the absence of texture. It absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The air around it had the same flat quality as the light in the forest. No face, arms at its sides, head tilted at that same slight angle. I stood still and looked at it, and it looked at me, and neither of us moved for what felt like a long time. Then it turned and walked south into the trees. I followed it. I do not have a clean explanation for that decision. It was not bravery. It was not stupidity. It was the same feeling you get when you've been circling something for long enough that the circling itself becomes the worst option. I followed it into the trees south of the clearing, and the forest closed around me. My compass spun. The light dropped. The undergrowth thinned in a way that made no sense given how dense it had been on the way in. The figure moved ahead of me at a steady pace that I could match without hurrying. It did not look back. It moved through the forest without disturbing anything. No branch moved as it passed. No leaf shifted. No ground compressed under it. I watched my own feet leave prints in the soft soil and watched its passage leave nothing. We walked for what I estimated was a quarter mile south of the clearing before it stopped. I stopped behind it. We were in a second clearing, smaller than the first, maybe 30 feet across. This one had no campsite, no stone ring, no markings on the surrounding trees. The ground in the center was different from anything I had seen in the forest before. The soil was black, not the dark brown of wet forest floor. Black in a way that looked burned but was not burned. No char smell, no ash, just black soil in a circle about 10 feet across in the center of the clearing. The figure stood at the edge of the black circle and did not move. I walked around the outside of it slowly. The temperature dropped near the circle, not dramatically, a few degrees at most, but consistent all the way around it. I crouched at the edge of the black soil and looked at it closely. The surface was smooth, not packed smooth. Smooth the way something is smooth when it's been smoothed deliberately over a very long time. I did not touch it. I stood and pulled out my notebook and sketched the clearing in the circle and noted the temperature drop and the compass behavior and the absence of any markings on the trees. I looked up from my notebook. The figure was gone. I was alone in the small clearing with the black circle. I stood there for a moment and then walked back north toward the first clearing. I found it without difficulty, which surprised me given how disorienting the forest had been on previous visits. The large clearing was still empty. I crossed it and continued north. The forest let me move normally on the way out. No disorientation. No shifting landmarks. My radio came back on at the same point it had cut out. My watch started again at the same point it had stopped. I made it back to the access point in just under an hour. My truck started immediately. I sat behind the wheel and wrote my notes while everything was still clear in my head. The black circle, the temperature drop, the compass behavior, the figure leading me there deliberately and then leaving once I had seen it. I drove back to the station and went straight to the archive files. I pulled everything related to the third cluster location and spread it across my desk. I was looking for any reference to a second clearing or a circle of black soil. I found nothing in the files. I pulled Voss's notebooks and read through them again. In the second notebook near the back, I found a single entry that I had missed on my first 2 reads. It was brief, 3 sentences. There's a second location south of the clearing. I do not know what it is. I am going back tomorrow. There was no entry for the following day. The page after that entry was the one where his handwriting changed. I set the notebook down and looked at my own sketch of the black circle. Whatever that circle was, it had changed something in Voss the day he found it. He had gone back the next day and come out different. I had stood at its edge and not touched it and walked away. I did not know if that mattered. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I kept thinking about the figure leading me to that circle, and then disappearing once I had seen it. It had not wanted me to touch it. It had wanted me to know it was there. I went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about why someone that had been operating in that forest for decades would want a game warden to know about a circle of black soil in a small clearing south of an old growth tree line. I did not sleep well. In the morning, I went to the station and found 4 new files on my desk. I added the locations to my map without thinking. My hand was moving the red marker before I had consciously decided to do it. All 4 locations fell inside the primary clusters. I stood back from the map and looked at it. My hand was still holding the marker. I set it down. On top of 4 new files was something that had not been there the day before. A manila folder with no case number, no date, no identifying information on the outside at all. I opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed me standing at the edge of the black circle in the small clearing, taken from the south edge of the clearing looking north. From behind the figure, I set the photograph down and took a step back. The image was clear and detailed. The angle placed the camera directly behind where the figure had been standing. The figure was not visible in the photograph, just me and the circle in the trees. The photograph had been taken yesterday and printed and placed on my desk overnight. I turned it over. On the back, in the same tight handwriting as Voss's notes, were 3 words. You found it. I checked every window and the door lock and the entry log. No entry after my departure the previous evening. I picked up my pack and drove back out to the forest. I did not plan to go back in that day. I drove out there and sat in the truck at the access lot and looked at the tree line. After about 20 minutes, the figure appeared at the edge of the trees. It stood in the open the way it had done before. Then it turned and went back in. I sat in the truck until it got dark. Then I drove home. I did not go in that day. My truck would not start for 40 minutes when I tried to leave the lot. I tried the engine again at 40 minutes, and it started. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook to the sketch of the black circle. I wrote beneath it in capital letters. It wants me to understand something. Then I went to bed. The cases kept coming the next 3 days. 8 new files total. All no reporting party. All inside the clusters. I added the locations to the map. On the 3rd day, I found something in the oldest file in my archive that I had overlooked every time I had gone through it. In the bottom right corner of the inside cover, someone had written a number in pencil, faint enough that I had missed it 3 separate times. It was not a case number. It was not a date. It was a count, 46. I counted every file with no reporting party. 46. Someone before me had counted them too and written that number in the oldest file and said nothing else. I wrote the number in my notebook and sat with it. 46 people. No one had ever called any of them in. No one had ever looked for any of them. Something had made sure of that. I thought about Voss's letter. The part that said it does not attack. It collects. I looked at my map with its red clusters and thought about what collecting meant over 40 years and what it might mean for the people whose names were in those files. I got up from the desk and walked to the window. The parking lot was empty. The tree line across the road was dark. Nothing at the edge of it. I went back to the desk and picked up the photograph with the 3 words on the back. You found it. I turned it over and looked at my own image, standing at the edge of that black circle. I put the photograph in my pack. I went to bed early. In the morning, I was going back in. I went back in the next morning before the sun was up. I moved through the first 2 miles without stopping and picked up the compass bearing at the trail end and pushed into the undergrowth. The forest did not fight me on this visit. No pressure behind the eyes. No silence dropping like a door. The sound of the forest stayed with me all the way to the clearing. Birds, wind in the upper canopy, my own footsteps. I noticed the normalcy of it more than I would have noticed the absence. It felt like being let through. The clearing was empty when I arrived. The old growth trees at the edges, the carved markings in the bark, the campsite undisturbed. I crossed to the south edge and went into the trees toward the smaller clearing. I found it in 10 minutes. The black circle was there. I crouched at its edge and looked at it the way I had the first time. Same smooth surface, same temperature drop at the perimeter. I pulled out my notebook and added to my previous sketches. I was there for about 20 minutes before I heard something behind me. I turned. The figure was at the north edge of the small clearing, not moving, watching. I stood up slowly. It did not react to my movement. I took a step toward it. It held its position. I took another step. Still nothing. I walked toward it at a steady pace and stopped about 8 feet away. Close enough to see that the smoothness where its face should have been was not a mask or a covering. It was simply the surface of whatever it was. No features underneath. No outline of a nose or a mouth. Just a continuous curve playing the color of deep shadow. We stood there looking at each other for a long moment. Then it turned and walked north back toward the main clearing. I followed. We crossed a large clearing together and continued north into the forest past the point where I had always turned back before. The figure moved at the same steady pace. The forest around us stayed normal. Sounds present. Light behaving the way light should. I kept my compass in my hand, and it kept spinning, but I had stopped trusting it in here anyway. We walked north for what I estimated was a half-mile past a large clearing. The undergrowth thinned. The trees spread further apart. The ground rose slightly, which I had not expected given the topography of this part of the forest. At the top of the low rise, the figure stopped. I stopped beside it. Below the rise was a third clearing, long and narrow, running roughly east to west. It was different from the other 2. The ground inside it was covered in low flat stones arranged in rows. Not natural stone placement. Deliberate. The rows ran the length of the clearing with about 2 feet between each row. I counted the rows from where I stood. 17. The stones in each row were spaced about 3 feet apart. I did not count them. The figure descended the rise into the clearing and moved between the rows without disturbing any of the stones. I followed it down. I walked along the edge of the nearest row and looked at the stones. They were unmarked. No carvings. No symbols. Just flat gray stones pressed into the soil with their edges flush to the ground. I crouched at one and looked at the soil around it. The stone had been here a long time. The edges had sunk. Moss had grown over the joins. I stood and looked at the rows stretching away from me. I thought about 46 files with no reporting party. I thought about the count written in pencil in the oldest archive file. I thought about Voss's letter and the word collecting. I did not say anything out loud. I did not need to. I understood what I was looking at. The figure stood at the far end of the clearing, watching me come to that understanding. It did not move. It did not make a sound. I walked slowly along the edge of the clearing and counted the rows again as I walked. 17 rows. I reached the far end where the figure stood and turned and looked back at the length of the clearing. The stones ran all the way to the rise at the other end. I looked at the figure. It looked back. Then it turned and walked east out of the clearing into the trees. I did not follow it this time. I stood at the end of the clearing for a while, and then walked back up the rise the way I had come. I moved north to south through the large clearing without stopping and continued south out of the forest. My compass worked normally from the point where I crossed back into familiar territory. My radio came back on. My watch started. I reached the truck and sat behind the wheel and did not move for a long time. I drove back to the station and sat at my desk without turning on the lights. The stack of files was there. The map was there. The photograph was there. I sat in the dark and thought about the rows of stones and what they meant and what had been happening in that forest for longer than any of the records I had access to could account for. After a while, I turned on the desk lamp and looked at my map. I picked up the red marker and then set it back down. I did not add anything to the map. I went home and did not sleep. I came back the next morning, and the figure was outside, not at the tree line across the road. Outside, standing in the parking lot of the station 30 feet from the front door, in full daylight. I sat in my truck and looked at it through the windshield. It stood between me and the door. I got out of the truck and walked toward the entrance. It did not block me. It stepped aside as I approached and stood watching as I unlocked the door. I went inside and looked back through the window. It was still in the parking lot. It stayed there for most of the morning. By noon, it was gone. 3 new files were on my desk. I looked at the locations. All 3 were inside the primary clusters. I set the files down and looked at the wall where my map and sketches were pinned. I had been at this post for 9 years. I had found 46 files with no reporting party. I had found a clearing full of stones. I had been led there deliberately by something that had been operating in that forest for as long as anyone had been keeping records of it. I thought about Voss going back in and not coming out. I thought about his campsite in the large clearing and the Warren Depression, where he had slept for what looked like years. I thought about his letter saying the only choice was how far and you were willing to go. I pulled my pack from under the desk and checked my gear. I drove out to the forest that afternoon. I parked at the access lot and went in. The forest was quiet in the normal way. The 2-mile trail, the compass bearing, the undergrowth, the large clearing, the campsite. I crossed the clearing and sat down on the ground near the stone ring with my back against one of the old growth trees. I waited. The light in the clearing shifted as the afternoon moved toward evening. Birds called somewhere in the canopy. The forest sounded like a forest. Then it did not. The silence came down the way it always did, complete and immediate. I looked toward the south edge of the clearing. Arthur Voss was sitting against a tree on the opposite side of the clearing with his knees drawn up and his hands resting on them. He was looking at me. He was alive. He looked older than the photograph from a newspaper article, but it was him. The same narrow face, the same careful eyes. He looked like a man who had been sitting in that clearing for a very long time and had been expecting me for most of it. I stared at him across the clearing. He looked back without surprise. Then he spoke. His voice was steady and unhurried. He said the triangle did not take him. He said he stayed. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked him how long he had been here. He said he had lost an accurate count, but that it had been more than 20 years by his best estimate. I looked at him. He did not look like a man who had been living in a forest for 20 years. He looked worn but not broken. His clothes were old but intact. He was thin but not starved. He looked like a man who had adapted. I asked him if he had left the notes for me. He said he had left them for whoever came next. He said there had been someone before me and someone before that person, and that he had left notes each time. I asked him what happened to the others. He looked at the ground for a moment and then back at me. He said they went further and then he had advised. I asked him what that meant. He said there was a point inside the forest past a stone clearing where the thing that operated here made a different kind of offer. He said the wardens who went past that point did not come back out. They were still here, just not in a form that went home at night. I sat with that for a long time. The figure was not visible, but I had the sense it was nearby. I asked Voss what the stones were. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said they were not graves. I asked him what they were. He said they were records. He said the thing that operated here did not bury its collections. It marked them. The people in the files were not dead in any way he could explain with certainty. They were held in the same way the forest held certain sounds and certain light, present but not accessible from the outside. I looked at the old growth trees and thought about how long something would have to operate in one place to accumulate the pattern I had found in those files. I asked Voss why it had led me here. He said it led everyone here eventually. He said the wardens were useful to it. The files kept the record current from the outside. Someone had to receive them. Someone had to come looking. That was the function. I asked him what happened if I stopped coming. He said the files would stop making sense to me. He said one morning I would come in and look at the stack on my desk and feel nothing about them and file them away and forget I had ever thought they were unusual. He said that was what happened to the wardens who left, not the ones who went too far in, the ones who simply stopped. They forgot. I thought about the transfer request that had been denied and whether the denial had come from the department or somewhere else. I asked Voss if he had ever tried to leave. He said yes. Once. He said he had walked out of the forest and driven to the state line and sat in a parking lot for 6 hours. He said by the time he drove back, he could not remember why he had left. He said the forgetting started at the tree line and was complete within a day. He came back because nothing on the outside remembered him well enough to make staying worth it. I looked at him across the clearing. He looked back without self-pity. He had the expression of a man who had made his peace with a situation over a very long time. I asked him what I was supposed to do. He said that was the only question entirely mine to answer. I sat across from Voss in the clearing for a long time before either of us spoke again. The forest around us stayed quiet in the normal way. Birds somewhere above. A light wind moving through the upper canopy. Whatever controlled the silence in this place had decided not to use it right now. I asked Voss to show me what he knew. He stood without hurry and crossed the clearing toward the south tree line. I followed him. We went through the trees to the small clearing with the black circle. He stopped at its edge and looked at it the way a man looks at something he has looked at thousands of times and still does not fully understand. He told me the circle was not a door and not a wound. He said it was the oldest part of what was here, the point of origin. Whatever had been operating in this forest had been operating outward from this spot for longer than he could calculate. He said the trees around the large clearing were old growth because nothing had touched them since before the region had a European name. The thing here had kept them. I asked him what the thing was. He said he did not have a word for it that meant anything useful. He said it was not evil in any way he had found evidence for. It did not cause suffering in the people it collected. It simply removed them from the outside world and kept them in a state he could not describe with precision, present but suspended, like a sound still vibrating in a room after the source has stopped. He said the forgetting worked in both directions. The collected person forgot the outside, and the outside forgot them, clean and complete. I asked him if the people in the stone clearing knew where they were. He said he believed they did not. He said it was closer to deep sleep than to anything else he had found a comparison for. I walked with him back to the large clearing, and we sat again. The figure appeared at the south edge while we were talking. It stood there, without moving, and Voss did not look at it with any particular concern. He said it had been present for most of his conversations in this clearing. He said it listened. I asked him if it understood language. He said he believed it understood intent more than language, that what you meant carried further than what you said. I looked at it standing at the edge of clearing. It looked back. I thought about 46 files and 17 rows of stones, and a campsite worn down to bare earth by years of use. I thought about the warden before me and the warden before that one, and the letter Voss had written to people he would never meet. I asked him what happened to the ones who went too far in, past the stone clearing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said they were still in the forest in the same way the others were, the collected ones. He said the difference was they had gone willingly past the point of return, and what was here had obliged them. He said it did not force anything. It never had. It simply offered and waited. I asked him what it had offered them. He said the same thing it was offering me, to stay and know, to be part of what was here instead of a visitor at the edge of it, to remember everything instead of walking out and losing it all at the tree line. I sat with that. The offer had a logic to it that I could follow. Everything I had found over the past weeks had been leading here. Every file, every marking, every black photograph, every case with no reporting party. It had all been a path. A careful, deliberate path laid out for me the way Voss had said was laid out for everyone who held this post. The thing here was patient in a way that made human patience look like impatience. It had been doing this since before the land had a name. I looked at Voss. He looked back and did not try to influence what I was thinking. He had the stillness of a man who had already made his choice and had no investment in mine. I looked at the figure at the south edge of the clearing. It stood without moving, without pressure. The offer was there the way a door is there, requiring nothing but a decision. I thought about my desk at the station, the stack of files, the red marks on the map, the denial notice pinned to the wall. I thought about driving home and lying in the dark, unable to sleep. I thought about the parking lot at the station in full daylight with the figure standing 30 feet from the door and nobody else seeing it. I thought about what Voss had said about the forgetting, that it started at the tree line and was complete within a day, that the wardens who left forgot. I stood up. I told Voss I was leaving. He nodded once. He did not say anything else. I crossed the clearing heading north and did not look back at the figure at the south edge. I walked north through the forest, and the sounds came back with me the way they had on the way in. Normal forest sounds. Normal light. Compass working. Radio live. I reached the 2-mile mark and the maintained trail and kept moving. At the tree line, I stepped out into the open, and the weight of the forest lifted off my shoulders in a way I had not noticed it sitting there until it was gone. I got in my truck. I drove back to the station. I sat at my desk and picked up a pen and pulled a piece of paper from the drawer. I wrote one sentence before the edges of what I remembered started going soft. I wrote it in capital letters and underlined it twice and folded the paper and put it in the top drawer of my desk under everything else in there. Then I filed the open cases. All of them. I cleared the map off the wall. I stacked Voss's notebooks in a box and put them in a storage cabinet. I drove home. I made something to eat. I went to bed. In the morning, I came into the station and poured my coffee and sat down at my desk and stared at the wall where the map had been. I could feel the shape of something I was supposed to remember, but the content of it was gone. I opened the desk drawer to get a pen. Under the other things in the drawer, there was a folded piece of paper. I did not remember putting it there. I unfolded it. It was my own handwriting. Capital letters. Underlined twice. It said stop looking. I read it 3 times. I turned it over. The back was blank. I sat with it in my hands for a while, trying to find the memory that went with it. There was nothing there. Just the words and the sense of something large and important sitting just past where I could reach. I set the paper down on the desk. A new case file landed in my inbox through the interdepartment system. I picked it up out of habit. Missing person. Last seen near the Freetown State Forest boundary. No reporting party. No next of kin. No contact number. The location coordinates fell inside a cluster on a map I no longer had on my wall, but could still picture. without knowing why. I set the note with my handwriting on it to the side. I opened the case file. I read through the file twice. The details were thin. A name, a physical description, a date, a location. I pulled up the department map and entered the coordinates. The pin dropped inside the Freetown State Forest boundary in an area I had patrolled for years. There were 2 more files waiting in the system, both missing persons, both with no reporting party, both with coordinates inside the forest. I added them to the stack and looked at the 3 files in front of me. Something about the stack bothered me in a way I could not articulate. Not the content. The number, 3 files with no reporting party, felt like it should mean something more than it did. I pulled the archive files from the cabinet to check if this was a recurring pattern. The archive went back 30 years. I spread the oldest files across the desk and started going through them. An hour and I had found 11 files across the archive with no reporting party, all with coordinates inside the same section of the Freetown Forest. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper and started plotting the locations. My hand knew the map without needing to reference one. The points landed in clusters without me intending them to. I sat back and looked at what I had drawn. The clusters were specific, 3 primary locations repeating across decades. I stared at the pattern for a long time. It felt familiar in a way that had nothing to do with the current files. It felt like something I had looked at before. I opened the top drawer to get a red marker. Under the things in the drawer, the folded piece of paper was still there. I had set it aside and forgotten it. I picked it up and unfolded it again. Stop looking. My own handwriting. Underlined twice. I looked at the cluster map I had just drawn. I looked at the 3 new files. I looked at the note. I put the note back in the drawer and picked up the red marker. I added the 3 new locations to the cluster map in red. They landed exactly where I expected them to land, without knowing why I expected it. I pinned the map to the wall. I picked up the first new file and opened it to the location page. I was going to need to visit that site. Something about it required a physical check, and I knew that the same way I knew the cluster pattern, without being able to say how I knew it. I pulled on my jacket and picked up my pack from under the desk. The folded note was still in the drawer. I did not take it with me. I drove out toward the Freetown State Forest with the file on the passenger seat, and the morning coming on gray and cold the way mornings did in late October in this part of Massachusetts. The access road looked the way it always looked. The tree line looked the way it always looked. I parked at the lot and sat for a moment with the engine off. The forest was still. I picked up the file and got out of the truck. I walked to the tree line and stopped. Something at the edge of my thinking told me I had stood at this exact spot before, and that standing here had led somewhere significant. I could not get to the memory. It was there the way things are there in the moment before sleep, when the mind starts letting go of the day, present and then not. I stood at the tree line for another moment. Then I walked in. The trees closed around me. The sounds of the forest came up the way they always did when I crossed the boundary. Birds, wind, my own footsteps on the soft ground. I moved along the trail I knew without thinking about it. The morning light came down flat through the canopy, the way it did on overcast days in this part of the forest. My radio was live. My compass held steady. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. I did not notice the silence when it dropped. I did not notice my compass starting to spin. I did not notice the trail ending and the undergrowth beginning. I just kept walking, deeper in, the way I always did.